June 4th, 1944, somewhere outside Harland, Iowa. The morning light rose slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to touch a world already so consumed by war. The horizon burned gold, where the sun brushed against endless fields of corn, each stalk wet with dew, each shimmering droplet reflecting the quiet persistence of life. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and honey, thick, sweet, almost cloying, as it drifted from the rows of beehives lined neatly beside the barn. From a distance, the boxes looked like soldiers standing in formation, waiting for orders that would never come. John Winslow Carson, age 36, stood with one hand resting on the rough frame of a hive. His flannel shirt, worn soft from years of labor, clung to his back in the rising humidity. Bees orbited him in steady patterns, disciplined, unwavering, like tiny golden machines of purpose. In the way they worked, there was no hesitation, no fear. To watch them was to witness a kind of order the world beyond these fields had lost. John tilted his head slightly, eyes squinting under the brim of his sweat-darkened cap, and for a fleeting moment, he looked less like a farmer and more like a general, commanding, observing, carrying the quiet authority of someone who understands the rhythm of his army. He dipped a spoon into a jar, the honey slow and heavy, amber catching the sunlight like liquid gold. As it coiled back into the glass, his gravelly voice broke the still air. "Sweetest thing in the world," he muttered. Then after a pause, a shadow crossed his face. "But ain't nothing sweet about this war." The words hung there, suspended in the hum of bees and the faint growing rumble beyond the horizon. At first, he thought it was thunder, distant, rolling. But then he knew. Not thunder, not tractors, airplanes, B-17, flying fortresses, their massive wings slicing through the sky in low formation, their engines vibrating the very air above his farm. Training flights headed east, headed for England, for Europe, for hell. John shaded his eyes and watched them pass, silver bellies flashing like fish beneath the morning sun. He didn't wave. There was no one to wave to, not anymore. His younger brother Mark had shipped out the previous winter. No letters for weeks now, just silence. The war felt both impossibly far and unbearably close, a strange dream that had swallowed every able-bodied man and left behind the quiet ones, the farmers, the watchers, the men whose battlefields were measured not in miles of mud, but in acres of soil. Bees buzzed around his head, their rhythm unbroken. He reached for another jar when the calm fractured. A low growl rolled up the gravel path, a sound heavier than any tractor, a military truck, olive drab, United States Army markings. A soldier stepped down, clipboard in hand, voice clipped, official. "John Carson." "That's me," John answered cautiously. "You're on the list," the soldier replied without preamble. "We're requisitioning honey for shipment to the 8th Army. Says here you've got 350 hives, that right?" "That's right," John said slowly. "But you really need honey over there?" The soldier's jaw tightened. "Sir, we need everything, especially what lasts." John watched as the truck backed toward his barn, its tires crunching on the gravel. The smell of exhaust mingled with the sweetness of the air. A strange pride swelled in him, muted, conflicted, because it wasn't guns or bullets he was sending, just jars of honey. "Ain't no one ever won a war with bees' spit," he muttered under his breath. But he was wrong, and in 72 short hours, one of his foolish ideas involving that very honey would help save a convoy of American trucks rolling through occupied France. They called him a fool, a nobody, just a farmer, until his honey trick changed everything, the farm, the bees, perhaps even the war itself. John Winslow Carson was not a hero by the standards of medals and parades. He was a man of dirt and patience, of seasons measured by the hum of insects and the color of the fields. Born in 1908, he inherited 160 acres of land from his father, a weather-beaten barn, a line of tractors in various stages of disrepair, and a handful of beehives tucked beneath an old apple tree. By 1935, he had turned that modest beginning into a full-scale beekeeping operation. Over 200 colonies, nearly 12 million bees. Every season, he harvested close to 3,000 pounds of honey, enough to sweeten every cup of coffee in his county, enough to call himself one of the most productive beekeepers in southwestern Iowa. But in 1941, the world shifted on its axis. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, the day everything changed. America went to war, and suddenly, every man, every field, every jar mattered. John watched his neighbor's sons march off to enlist, watched his brother board a train under gray skies. He was 33 then, with a bad knee that never healed right after a plowing accident. The Army labeled him 4F, unfit for service. That letter haunted him like a scar he couldn't show. He wanted to fight. Instead, they told him to grow, to harvest, to produce. While others bled in Italy and the Pacific, John filled quotas for sugar beets, corn, soybeans. His war was measured in weight and bushels, not bullets. But it was the bees, not the crops, that would matter most. By 1942, sugar was gold. The government rationed it down to 26 pounds per person per year, barely a quarter of what Americans were used to. Sugar was needed for everything: food, medicine, even explosives. So the Army turned to honey. Honey that didn't spoil, didn't freeze, didn't need anything but time. It was energy in a jar. The Department of Agriculture took note. In 1943, John's name appeared on a government ledger, registered producer with surplus capacity. A letter arrived one morning, stamped in red, an offer for a small military contract. 700 pounds of honey to be delivered to Des Moines. No fanfare, no promises, just a job to do. He loaded the jars himself, labeled each carefully, and handed them off to men in uniform he didn't know. The truck disappeared down the road, and he went back to the hives. He didn't think about it again. But somewhere beyond the horizon, men in labs and field hospitals had begun to see honey differently. Tests showed honey could sterilize wounds. It starved bacteria of life. It could coat metal against rust. Mixed with beeswax, it sealed tanks and muffled the creak of armored joints. Quiet tools for a noisy war. John knew none of it. His world was smaller. Rows of hives, a stack of ration books, the low thrum of engines passing overhead. Letters from Mark came less and less often. By the end of 1943, John had 350 hives, 20 million bees producing enough honey to fill a freight car. He was feeding an army, but he didn't know it. He still believed he was on the sidelines. He couldn't have known that his quiet labor in the heart of Iowa would soon collide with one of the strangest logistics miracles of the entire war. All it would take was one moment, one idea, and a trick so foolish no one believed it could possibly work. By the spring of 1944, John Winslow Carson was producing more honey than anyone in his county, close to 4,000 pounds. The golden liquid poured from his hives like sunlight in motion. Yet the more he gave, the more frustrated he became. He didn't know where it went. The government trucks came, week after week. No faces, just signatures and engines fading over the hill. "Feels like throwing it into the ocean," he told his friend one night. "Can't even be sure it's reaching a soldier." His neighbors mocked him gently. "You still playing with bee juice?" one said after church. "We're trying to win a war here." Another added, "Heard the Army's going to send you a medal made of honeycomb." John forced a laugh, but bitterness clung to his tongue. He had lost 2 close friends to the draft. His brother's last letter was dated December. It was now April. Every night, he sat alone at the kitchen table, rereading that letter. Mark's handwriting faded, the words uneven. "We're cold, wet, sometimes hungry, but we move, always moving. If you send anything, send warmth." That line, "send warmth," echoed in him like a prayer. It changed the way he saw everything. Honey was no longer just sweetness. It was slow burning strength, stored sunlight, a soldier's warmth in the cold. And as he looked out over his fields that spring morning, the hum of bees rising around him like a living heartbeat, John Winslow Carson began to wonder if even the smallest things, the hum of wings, the taste of honey, could change the course of a war. The sound of the hives filled the air once more, steady and low, as if the earth itself were breathing. And somewhere far above, another B-17 crossed the horizon, its shadow gliding over the golden fields below, gone in a heartbeat, but leaving behind a tremor that lingered in the stillness. It was waterproof, sticky, and stubbornly enduring. It could coat, preserve, and bind. John remembered how his grandfather used to polish his boots with a mix of beeswax and oil until they gleamed like dark amber beneath the porch light. He recalled a neighbor plugging a radiator leak in his old Model A Ford, using nothing more than honey and faith. Those memories, small, practical miracles of rural life, stuck with him like a seed, waiting for the right season to grow. What if honey could do more? One evening, while the light faded over his fields and the cicadas sang their metallic rhythm in the trees, John wrestled with a stubborn barn hinge that screamed every time he tried to close the door. He dipped a rag into a jar of old honey mixed with linseed oil and rubbed it along the rusted joint. The hinge gave a soft groan, then silence. A silence so pure it startled him. He stood there in the dusk, the air warm and still, listening to nothing, just the soft hum of bees drifting home. The next morning, a truck from the Des Moines depot rolled into his yard. Same olive drab paint, same clipboard, same young corporal, whose uniform looked a little more wrinkled this time. His eyes were bloodshot, exhausted. "We lost 6 trucks last night," he said quietly, almost to himself. He didn't even realize what he'd let slip. Normandy. John frowned. Lost? How? "Machine noise," the corporal muttered. "The smell of oil. Krauts heard them coming miles off. We can't sneak up with trucks that creak like coffins and reek of diesel." Something clicked inside John. That same hinge that had cried out the night before now whispered to him. "I've got something," he said slowly. The corporal gave him a tired stare. "A compound," John explained. "Homemade. Stop squeaks. Masks smell. It's just honey, beeswax, linseed oil." The corporal blinked. "You want us to smear bee spit on army trucks?" John didn't flinch. "Might save 6 trucks next time." The corporal chuckled, half amusement, half disbelief. But as he looked at John, steady, serious, hands rough and stained from work, the laughter faded. "Fine," he said finally. "1 crate. I'll take it to the boys at Fort Riley. See what they say." That night, John didn't sleep. The hum of the hives outside was louder than usual, or maybe it was his own pulse echoing in the quiet. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. The world went on. The fields greened, the bees gathered, and the war thundered on beyond the horizon. He tried to let it go, but as he watched the bees move in perfect rhythm, weaving invisible patterns in the air, his mind kept circling back. There was no waste in their motion, no noise. Every wing beat served a purpose. He thought of how bees sealed their hives with propolis, how they used it to close cracks, to hide their scent from predators, to make their home invisible. "Those little bastards been doing stealth long before we figured it out," he muttered, almost smiling. Then, on May 12th, 1944, a black military sedan pulled into his yard. Not the usual truck this time. 2 men stepped out, no insignia, no small talk. One wore a medic's armband, the other a logistics badge. Their coats were brown, their expressions made of iron. "We heard you've been mixing some things," the officer in the coat said. John nodded. "I have." We ran a field test, the other added. 3 trucks. We coated the axles, doors, and exhaust hoods with your compound. John's heart thudded. And? They ran silent, smelled like a bakery, but quiet. Krauts didn't hear them until we were already behind the ridge. He handed John a paper, the kind that changed lives, with a few typed lines. Effective immediately, you're authorized to produce 100 gallons per month. Codename, Sweet Silence. John blinked. Excuse me? Sweet Silence, the officer repeated, tucking the document into John's calloused hands. Welcome to the war, Mr. Carson. For a long moment, John just stood there, the words ringing in his ears. Outside, the bees droned softly, but they didn't sound like bees anymore. They sounded like drums, distant and steady. He had crossed an invisible line from farmer to asset, from man tending hives to man feeding a war machine. By late May, his quiet workshop had transformed into something unrecognizable. The air was thick with sweetness and smoke. Buckets of raw honey lined the floor beside vats of melted beeswax and drums of linseed oil. The air was heavy, sticky, alive with scent, like standing inside the lungs of a hive. Every surface glistened, and flies buzzed against the window panes like prisoners. John didn't care. He worked through the night, stirring, pouring, sealing barrels one after another. Every week, a truck from Fort Riley arrived to collect his shipments, each drum labeled SSC-7, short for Sweet Silence, compound number 7. No other markings, no explanation. But one morning in June, a letter arrived. It wasn't from Mark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky, rushed, military. Your stuff works, it read. Coded 5 vehicles last week. Germans didn't hear us coming. Got the drop on them outside Carrington. 2 enemy trucks destroyed. 0 American casualties. Smelled like Christmas. Keep it coming. Sergeant Benjamin Gentry, 59th Logistics Division, ETO. John read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into a mason jar, sealing it like a keepsake, a medal made of words. Still, doubts gnawed at him. Could this really hold up? Could honey and wax change the course of anything so vast, so terrible? Or was this just one of those war stories soldiers tell to keep hope alive before this bullets start to fall? He went back to experimenting, adjusting ratios, changing consistency. One morning, while applying a thicker batch to an old flatbed axle, he noticed something new. The waxy layer didn't just stop the squeal, it softened the vibration. It absorbed sound itself. And in a war where enemy aircraft could pinpoint a convoy by the hum of its engines, vibration meant life or death. He wrote a note and sent it off to the same unknown channel. Compound now acts as vibration dampener. Try under hoods, side doors, exhaust seams. Also repels water. A week later, another letter came, this one typed official. Tested modifications on 8 Jeeps near St. Lo. Detection range reduced by 25%. Bravo. Authorization increased to 200 gallons per month. Shipped to Port of Liverpool for pre-invasion outfitting. Liverpool. Invasion. The pieces fell into place. John didn't need to ask what for. Everyone knew something enormous was coming. The rumors were everywhere, whispered like prayers. Fortress Europe was about to fall. On June 3rd, a courier truck arrived at his farm carrying sealed crates and typed instructions. Prepare 10 barrels for transatlantic shipment. Label, Class A engineering material. Destination, confidential. No insignia, no rank, just urgency. That night, as John sealed the final barrel, he paused at the doorway. The field stretched silent under a low gray sky. His bees slept in their wooden houses. No wind, no moon. Just the faint, rhythmic thunder to the west. Not weather, but war. The kind of sound that doesn't fade, only burrows into bone. He didn't know it yet, but within 10 days, those barrels would land in Normandy. And somewhere behind enemy lines, American soldiers would be coating their trucks with his mixture before rolling into the most dangerous roads of the war, Normandy, June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day. In the shattered countryside of France, convoys of American trucks crawled through ruined villages and narrow hedge-lined roads. The air was thick with smoke and the faint tang of salt from the Channel. German ambushes struck without warning, quick, brutal, but something had changed. Captain Lawrence Mendel of the 3rd Armored Division later wrote about it. "We moved like ghosts, no metallic clinks, no creaks, no diesel stench. They expected engines. Instead, we gave them silence and molasses. That silence had a name, Sweet Silence Compound Number 7, a sticky, dark mixture smeared over axles, hinges, and exhaust valves. Field mechanics called it bee grease. Infantrymen, grinning through mud and exhaustion, called it ghost syrup. Whatever they called it, it worked. Back in Iowa, John knew nothing of this. He just kept working, hands blistered from hot wax, arms aching from hauling barrels, eyes red from the constant haze of smoke and steam. He ate little, slept less. He was no longer farming honey. He was manufacturing survival. Then, on June 22nd, a military courier arrived. No words, just a manila envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph, grainy, torn along the edge, but clear enough. It showed a convoy of 6 American trucks parked safely behind hedgerows near Carentan. A soldier crouched beside one wheel, brush in hand, a tin can beside him. On the back, written in pencil, were 5 words that stopped John cold. "Your stuff, it saved us." He held the photograph for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly. Outside, the bees droned their eternal song, a soft, endless hum that seemed, for the first time, to echo something greater. And there, in the golden light filtering through his barn's open door, John Winslow Carson realized that even the smallest act, a jar of honey, a foolish experiment, a whispered idea, could ripple outward into history, carrying with it the quiet strength of 1,000 beating wings. The sound of bees rose gently, then faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of the wind in the grass. And somewhere, far away, the low, steady rhythm of engines running smooth as silence itself. It meant his work, his bees, his barn, his sweat, was no longer only local labor marked by weather and seasons. It was now poured, ladled, sealed into the larger machinery of liberation, a quiet current feeding a vast river that moved across charts and coastlines. By July, the U.S. Army's Logistics Command had authorized the expansion of Sweet Silence to a full dozen engineering units, and more than 400 gallons a week were slipping overseas in anonymous drums, while British and Canadian formations began requesting the compound for their night moves in Normandy and beyond. And still the secret held, sealed as tightly as wax over a hive crack. The Germans noticed fewer sounds, fewer mechanical signatures in the hedgerows. Engines that should have rattled like chains instead passed like breath. But they blamed terrain, blamed wind, blamed weather, never guessing that somewhere in Iowa, a man who once struggled to win a nod at the feed store had taught steel a lesson in stealth learned from nature itself. Then came the first real test. On the night of July 29th, Allied intelligence intercepted a plan to shell a crucial American resupply route near St. Lo. At least 3 divisions were leaning on that artery: fuel, ammunition, rations, field sets, everything a fighting line needed to keep from folding. And if those trucks were hit, entire forward positions would have to fall back. A decision was made quickly, without ceremony. Deploy a full convoy, 84 trucks, each coated in Sweet Silence. The mechanics had 6 hours. They worked with brushes, mops, even bare, gloved hands, rubbing the sticky mix into hinges and seams, along axles and hood seals. The compound clung and gleamed like sap from a wounded tree, the air sweet and acrid at once. At Auto 200, the convoy rolled. No headlights, no hungry revs, no squeals, only shadow upon shadow slipping through the mist. German scouts didn't hear it. German mortars didn't answer. And by Zor 600, the route was complete without a single loss. Not one truck struck, not one soldier wounded. The after-action report was the size of a postcard, and just as plain. Silence preserved operational secrecy. Recommend continued use of compound SSC-7 in night convoys. For the first time in the European theater, a logistics miracle had occurred, and no one could fully explain it, except, perhaps, one man in Iowa who suspected as much, because that same morning a package arrived from his brother Mark, and inside was a worn field jacket still carrying the ache of sweat and diesel, and a note in a hurried hand that read, "Your honey got here before I did." John folded the paper and pressed it against his chest, then sat on the barn step, breathing in wax and oil and the faint, lingering hum of his hives. Beneath it all, he could smell the bees, and they smelled like hope. A small trick in a big battle, August 20th, 1944, the Falaise Gap, northern France. For weeks, the Allied push had driven the Wehrmacht east across Normandy. What began as a breakout had turned towards catastrophe, not for the Allies, but for the Germans, nearly 50,000 soldiers of the Heer caught between converging jaws. Seal that pocket, and the German line in France would buckle, let it leak, and the war in Europe would lengthen by months. The Gap, a tight 20-kilometer corridor of chewed farm roads and muddy tracks, became a geography of desperation. General Omar Bradley needed supply to move faster than fear. Fuel, ammunition, rations, radio spares, anything that kept formations from starving in place. Enter Convoy Echo 9, 212 trucks, 38 jeeps, a dozen half-tracks, all loaded to their rails and scheduled to thread the Falaise region under darkness along farm lanes barely wide enough for tractors, over bridges that protested under wagons, through tree lines so dense they swallowed the moon. At 1900, the motor pool commander gave an order that would have seemed absurd in a different war. Apply the Carson compound, full coverage. 36 mechanics sprang like a drill. Barrels stamped SSC-7 were rolled forward. Honey-based mixture, sticky, heavy, black gold, was brushed onto door hinges, axle joints, hood seams, tailgate locks. The air filled with the scorched sugar bite of the linseed and the sweet undertow of the hive. Inside one of those trucks sat Sergeant Mark Carson of 1st Armored, John's brother, unaware that the syrup painted onto his engine had come from the same hands that lifted him out of muddy ditches years ago in Iowa. He only heard the briefing. "These trucks don't squeak. They don't reek. You roll silent. You get there alive." By 22:30, the convoy stood ready. Engines turned over with a soft purr. No brassy revs, no clattering gear changes, just motion. Darkness was complete, moonless, fog thick as breath. Headlights were banned, radios muzzled. Only the dim star prick of sky knew the route. As the column moved, it passed within 1,000 meters, half a mile no more, of a German mortar section tucked into hedge near Troon. Later, scouts would swear the enemy never even shifted in their pits. No shells, no searchlights. But silence is not invincibility. 10 miles on, crossing a makeshift timber bridge over the dives, a German reconnaissance team caught the shadow of movement. One flare rose, white, then another, red, and then the answering crackle in the distance. The convoy split in a practiced shiver, half pressed forward through the kill zone, while the rest peeled into a ravine below the ridge to work around the flanks. In a lead truck, Mark braced behind a Browning 30, voice steady though breath ran fast. "They see us now. Move." The surprise had purchased seconds, and the first 5 minutes of silence had carried them farther than any planner dared hope, just far enough to slip past the worst of the ambush geometry. German rounds tore the air but mostly lashed empty space, catching only the tail. 3 trucks struck, 8 men wounded, none lost. The remainder, 198 vehicles, rolled through with their cargo, over 100 tons of ammunition, 5,000 gallons of fuel, 2 whole-field hospitals in crates, sutures, plasma, stretchers, everything a frontline needs to keep beating. They arrived in time to stiffen the Canadian First Army, which swung the door shut on the Falaise pocket the next morning. That night, bone-tired men threw up triage tents and set to refilling batteries and shell racks with a discipline that sounded like prayer. Someone, cold and reckless with relief, lit a cigarette. The medic next to him growled, "Careful, this is a sugar field. You'll catch fire." And for a moment, laughter returned, the first clean sound in days. The name Carson Compound found its way into reports. Even General George S. Patton, in a debrief that was more iron than poetry, muttered, "Whatever voodoo they're putting on those trucks, keep doing it." But the line that mattered most did not arrive from a general. It came in a battered envelope back in Iowa, foreign stamps smeared by rain, a torn strip of tent canvas inside, and 4 plain sentences in a hand John knew even before he read it. "They used your stuff on our truck. We rolled quiet, even under fire. I shot back and lived. Some didn't, but most of us made it. Mark." John stood in his kitchen with the letter open on the table and the room breathing around him. He did not shout. He did not weep. He nodded once, as if answering a roll call only he could hear, then walked to the hives, lifted a lid with care, and whispered, "You did good, girls." There was nothing else to say. The bees kept working. They did not know about pockets or maps or the word Wehrmacht, about armored columns, or the way Blitzkrieg had once promised speed and surprise. They only knew sealing, protecting, building, what the compound had done, sweet, sticky silence, carrying men through the thinnest hour toward one more dawn. The legacy of a quiet war trick is that it does not demand attention. It folds into the larger motion and goes on working long after the cheers move elsewhere. The war did not end in Normandy. It thundered east across France toward Belgium, through the frozen skeletons of the Ardennes, and at last into the broken streets of Berlin, while the Luftwaffe faded against skies it no longer owned, and the old certainty of iron gave way to the slow power of supply. But for John Winslow Carson, the portion of the conflict that belonged to his hands and his hives ended on a September morning in 1944, when the trucks simply stopped coming. No letter, no explanation, just the sudden stillness of a road left empty. Barrels stood stacked and ready, resin cooling in their rims. The compound was set. No one arrived to haul it away. John did not ask questions. He didn't need to. In war, absence is a kind of clarity. Allied lines had broken past the point where stealth on farm lanes decided fates. Logistics shifted. New compounds and technologies, born in labs with budgets and stamped with codes, were already in play. Their development measured not in jars, but in ledgers. The army no longer needed a beekeeper's trick. That too was a kind of victory, quiet, unsentimental, earned. John wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the yard, the afternoon light falling soft on the hive lids, the world resettling into the rhythm of fields and chores. Out beyond the hedgerow, a wind came up and crossed the grass with the faintest sound, and somewhere in that gentle hush, a single bee lifted, drew a small figure 8 in the air, and vanished into the sunlit hum. But that didn't mean it hadn't mattered. In the archives of the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, buried deep between tables of tire wear and engine oil viscosity, lies a single quiet sentence. Temporary vehicle coating designated SSC-7 demonstrated minor but measurable improvement in stealth movement under limited field conditions. Source: Civilian Supplier, Iowa. No medal, no commendation, not even a footnote of recognition. Just one line, anonymous, uncelebrated, almost invisible. Yet somehow, that seemed right. John never did it for glory. When the war ended and victory roared through American streets in a shower of ticker tape and brass bands, John Winslow Carson simply went back to what he had always known. He repaired his old tractors with hands that no longer trembled. He painted the barn a deep red, the way his father once had. He split his hives in preparation for a clover bloom so heavy it bent the fields into soft waves of green and gold. And when Mark finally returned home, thinner, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much, they spoke little of war. Words weren't necessary. They sat on the porch at dusk, coffee in tin mugs, watching bees drift like sparks over the pastures. After a long silence one evening, Mark said softly, "Heard they tested your stuff on the Navy too." John smirked. "Well, hell," he replied, "maybe I sank a U-boat." For the first time in months, they both laughed. Real laughter, clean, unguarded, the kind that makes the air feel lighter. Years slipped by. The compound was never made again. Its formula existed only in John's mind, a mix of instinct, memory, and the smell of summer honey thick in the air. No patent, no recipe, just the knowledge of how something simple could matter. In 1953, when a government inspector stopped by his property for a routine agricultural survey, John answered questions about crop yields, production numbers, and beekeeping methods. At the end of the long form, the man asked almost idly, "Did your operation contribute to the war effort?" John paused, leaning on the doorframe. "In a way," he said quietly, "I kept some folks alive." The inspector blinked, confused. "You grew food?" John smiled faintly. "No, I made them harder to hear." The man didn't write that down. By the 1960s, the barn was sagging under its own years, and the last barrels of the Sweet Silence compound stood rusted and empty, their lids curled like paper. The hives, though, those were eternal. The bees still worked, tireless and precise, humming through the same rituals they had known for millennia. They didn't need gratitude, neither did John. He passed in 1971 at 63. His obituary in the Harlan County Register ran 4 short lines. John W. Carson, lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at home, survived by his brother Mark, known locally for his honey. No mention of Normandy, no mention of Convoys, no mention of the quiet invention that had helped save lives halfway across the world. Yet the land remembered. Time moved on, but the farm remained, a skeleton of wood and wire wrapped in the soft green persistence of Iowa summers. Decades later, a child wandering past the old property found something half buried beneath a rusted gate, a small metal box, its lid corroded and bent. Inside, a cracked jar. Inside the jar, a folded note stiff with age. The words, written in fading pencil, said simply, "Sweet Silence. Remember us." And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes the smallest acts in the largest wars don't need to be remembered by everyone, only by the ones they saved. It's easy, even comforting, to believe that history is made by generals and tanks, by men standing on podiums, and by battles with names carved into granite. But sometimes history moves differently. It hums instead of roars. It's shaped by a man alone in a barn, or by a swarm of bees, or by a sticky golden substance that was never meant for war. John Carson never stormed a beach. He never fired a rifle or commanded a platoon. But his honey, his stupid trick, as he'd once called it, rolled through the mud of Normandy. It crossed rivers under blackout skies. It clung to the axles of trucks carrying wounded boys home. And it did something almost nothing in war ever does. It saved lives without taking any. There is something profoundly American in that, and profoundly human. that in the middle of the deadliest conflict our species has ever seen, one man, using nothing more than patience, bees, and sunlight stored in liquid amber, could tip the balance, not with violence, but with ingenuity. A jar of honey became a weapon of silence, and for a fleeting golden moment, silence itself became victory. So maybe it's worth asking, how many other small acts have we forgotten? How many wars have been nudged, not by firepower, but by ideas born in barns, basements, or backyards? How many ordinary people shaped history with hands that never touched a trigger? And maybe that's the real legacy of John Carson. Not a product, not a formula, not even a story, but a reminder that sometimes the simplest things can carry the weight of nations. So here's my question to you. What's the most unexpected way you've ever seen someone make a difference? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story made you pause, if it made you see war or service or silence a little differently, share it, pass it on. Because sometimes the sweetest part of history is the part we almost missed. Outside, somewhere in the tall grass of Iowa, the bees still hum. Low, steady, eternal. A sound softer than victory, but stronger than time.